Imagine trusting someone for over 70 years, building together, growing together, protecting each other, and suddenly, you're treated like a stranger, like an enemy. That's how Japan felt in 2025, betrayed not by an enemy, but by its greatest ally, the United States. For decades, Japan and the United States were more than just partners. They were brothers in arms and trading partners. Since the war, the two countries have built a relationship that goes far beyond treaties. It is an alliance of mutual trust. Japan relinquished its military sovereignty, hosted American bases on its soil, and aligned its foreign policy with Washington's interests, expecting stability, respect, and reciprocity. But in 2025, it suffered the repercussions: sanctions, pressure, and contempt. As if this shared history could be erased with a single signature. And most shockingly, it happened just when Japan needed support most. Despite all its technological advances, the Japanese economy was struggling. The population was aging, demand was stagnant, and domestic problems were dire. Even so, the country continued to invest billions of dollars in the United States. It built factories, created jobs, and helped revitalize entire cities. In states like Kentucky, Alabama, and Mississippi, Japanese factories saved families from unemployment. Japanese automakers alone created more than 800,000 jobs for Americans, directly and indirectly. This goes beyond a simple trade relationship. It's a bond that impacts the lives of millions of people on both sides of the Pacific. That's why the blow was so painful. In 2025, under the pretext of national security, the United States classified Japanese cars as a strategic threat. Yes, you read that right. The Toyota, which millions of Americans buy for its reliability and price, the Honda Civic, which has become an iconic model on the road and in movies. From Washington's perspective, it now represents a threat to the country. As a result, tariffs of 25 to 30% on Japanese cars are expected. This decision has sparked an outcry in Tokyo and could trigger a devastating domino effect. How could Japan be so hostile to a loyal ally? Was it naive to believe that loyalty alone would suffice? The shock was immediate, but Japan's reaction was even more radical. Prime Minister Shigeru Oshiba called the measures extremely disappointing and regrettable. Finance Minister Katsunobu Katao warned that the measures could destabilize not only the Japanese economy, but the entire global recovery. Bank of Japan. Governor Kazuo was clear. The country urgently needed to rethink its economic policy. And I'm not exaggerating. These tariffs don't just affect CEOs. They threaten workers, engineers, truck drivers, and small businesses. Thousands of lives depend on these machines, and now they're at risk of being shut down. But the real conflict may lie beneath the surface, for this isn't just about trade. It's about pride. It's about dignity. It's about recognizing each other as partners, not puppets. For decades, Japan has relied on diplomacy, stability, and a strategic alliance with the United States. For decades, it has made concessions, and now it feels that at the slightest sign of instability, Washington is willing to sacrifice everything for short-term political gain. An alarming question is echoing through the corridors of the Japanese government. If even Japan is not immune to American retaliation, who is? We are facing not just a tariff conflict, but also a radical upheaval in the foundations of post-war geopolitics. For if even the strongest pillars can crumble, what about newly built bridges? What is stopping other traditional allies like South Korea, the Philippines, or India from rethinking their alliances? And, more worryingly, is the world witnessing the beginning of a global reorganization in which dependence on the West gradually gives way to alternative arrangements led by powers with different rules? As world leaders bicker, factories slow production, and markets watch in silence, the stakes are much higher than cars or tariffs. The idea is that alliances are based on long-term commitments, not short-term consideration. With its increasingly assertive stance, Japan is clearly demonstrating that it will no longer tolerate being treated as a minor player on the international political stage. It wants to be the master of its own destiny. But how did this rupture become irreversible? What silent movement behind the scenes of diplomacy and in the corridors of multinational corporations have begun to reshape the landscape of global power? This is the story we will tell later. And what happens next could change not only the fate of Japan and the United States, but also the economic balance of the entire planet. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that the factory where you've worked for 10 years is laying off its employees, not because of bankruptcy or mismanagement, but because of a political decision made thousands of miles away by a man who has never set foot in your town. Suddenly, your livelihood, your family's livelihood, and that of hundreds of your neighbors are threatened. Now imagine that this factory, built with Japanese investment, creates jobs, pays taxes, promotes trade, funds schools and hospitals. And yet, the US government treats it like an enemy. This silent reality is spreading across the United States, particularly in states where the Japanese auto industry has established a presence, such as Kentucky, Ohio, Alabama, Mississippi, and Texas. There, brands like Toyota, Honda, Nissan, and Subaru aren't just logos on factory signs. They're an integral part of people's lives. They keep auto parts stores open, gas stations open, and rent payments on time. In Georgetown, Kentucky, for example, Toyota directly employs thousands of people and indirectly supports tens of thousands more. These are parents who bought homes with those wages. These are young people who started their careers on the assembly line. These are workers who know that every shift impacts the growth of their cafe, their store, their neighborhood, and now all of that is at risk. With new tariffs of up to 30%, the cost of Japanese cars produced in the United States will explode. And no, this will affect not only cars imported from Japan, but also those already produced in the United States, because many of these components, technologies, and processes will continue to be produced in Japan. Rising costs will drastically reduce the competitiveness of these factories, and with it, revenues, profits, and jobs will decline. Sounds paradoxical, doesn't it? Sanctions against companies that generate wealth in the country, but that's exactly what's happening. And that's not all. The pressure isn't limited to cars. The US government is also tightening controls on the high-precision chips Japan sells to China. Why would it care? Because these chips are ubiquitous in cell phones, cars, microwave ovens, and medical devices. Japan is the leading manufacturer of the devices that produce these chips. And with the ban on sales to China, it's not just Japan that's suffering. The entire global flow of technology is collapsing. The cruel irony is that by attempting to punish China economically, the United States is directly harming one of its closest allies, thereby jeopardizing the stability of its own domestic market. It's like sawing off the branch you're sitting on and complaining when it falls. In Japan, the reaction was more moderate, but just as strategic. The Prime Minister and his ministers warned that if the United States continued this policy, Japan would have to seriously reconsider its action. In practical terms, this would mean factory closure. New investment could be diverted. What was previously produced in the United States could now be produced abroad, thanks to American jobs, in countries like Thailand, Indonesia, or even China. Ironically, the very country Washington is trying to contain. It's the beginning of a chain reaction, and the most dangerous one, silent, because it doesn't happen all at once. It happens when a new factory is built in another country, when a production line is relocated, when expansion investments are canceled. Small business decisions that, together, build a new future without the United States. Now stop and think, how many of these decisions are being made right now as you watch this video? Japan-US relations have always been a model of strategic partnership, but this is a global warning. Blind faith in alliances can be costly, and the question remains more than ever. If Japan is abandoned in this way, who will be its next ally? The repercussions are still being felt, but one thing is certain: this is not just a trade conflict. It is a shift in power, a redistribution of trust, a wake-up call for those who believed in guaranteed stability. And when the earth begins to shake between the giants, the waves reach everyone, including you. If you are passionate about this topic, if you feel that the world is changing faster than ever, and you want to understand what is really behind this tension, subscribe to the channel. Now, this is just the beginning. Leave your like, because it allows us to reach more people with information often missing from traditional media. And brace yourself, what's coming next will be even more profound and could have a direct impact on the way you work, consume, and live. See you in the next part. What would happen if Japan simply cut off its water supply? What would happen if, overnight, thousands of jobs, billions in investments, and decades of stability disappeared into American hands? Does it seem unlikely? Perhaps. But for the first time in decades, such a scenario is conceivable. And this isn't an empty threat. It's manifesting itself quietly through decisions that may not make headlines, but that will change people's lives. For example, Nissan has suspended production of 13,000 Rogue models at its Kyushu plant. This may seem like a technical adjustment, but it's actually a subtle signal. Japan is gearing up for challenges and is ready to make tough decisions. What is driving this? Behind the apparent contradiction between tariffs and public statement lies a deeper strategy. Japan isn't just reacting, it's repositioning its. Companies like Toyota and Mazda are shifting planned investments from the United States to Southeast Asian countries. Thailand, Indonesia, and Vietnam are gaining factories, jobs, and orders that would otherwise have flowed to American cities. Why? Japan no longer considers the United States a safe territory for the expansion of its automobile industry. Imagine the long-term effects. These aren't one-time sales. They're a slow exodus of factories, a structural change that could expose entire regions of the United States to economic collapse, just as the Rust Belt suffered from the decline of American manufacturing in recent decades. But why is Japan doing this now? Because this isn't just about cars. It's about the geopolitics of chips. Yes, semiconductor, the new gold rush of the 21st century. Japan is one of the few countries in the world that dominates the production of the equipment needed to make high-performance chips. And much of that equipment is shipped to China. Now, the United States is pressuring Japan to cut off those supplies. The logic is clear: curb China's technological progress. For Japan, however, this means abandoning multi-billion-dollar contracts and provoking China, its largest trading partner. So we are at a crossroad: submit to the United States and sabotage our economy, or defy Washington and risk political division. What would you do? The pressure mounted further when the U.S. Congress sent a confidential letter to the Japanese ambassador. It was a quiet gesture, but imbued with urgency and intensity. Its content? A direct request that Japan stop selling chip-making equipment to China. It wasn't a public statement. It was a quiet, almost desperate measure. But therein lies the paradox. Although the United States claims that the suspension of shipments to China is not harming Japanese companies, its own financial reports suggest otherwise. The stocks of the affected companies may be rising, but the actual profits, lost contracts, and disrupted trade relations are not reflected in the chart. And this process takes on even more symbolic significance. As the United States attempts to rein in Huawei, accusing it of secretly building chip factories, Japan is increasingly forced to take side, even though neither side can guarantee complete security. Are we really witnessing the emergence of a new Cold War? If this is true, Japan has become a silent battleground, a disputed territory between Washington and Beijing. Once again, as is often the case throughout history, it must confront the great powers, seeking to protect its sovereignty and avoid defeat. But is Japan ready to continue playing this role? This is where the landscape begins to change. Tokyo has already made it clear: no trade deal with the United States will be concluded without the elimination of tariffs. For the first time, Japan is adopting an openly confrontational stand. And that changes everything, because it demonstrates the country's willingness to risk its relationships, seek new allies, and break seemingly insurmountable patterns. Is the United States ready for this? If Japan cuts investment, reduces production, and relocates manufacturing to other regions, the consequences will be felt directly in the United States: job losses, lower incomes, and consumption. And, most seriously, international confidence in the American economy will suffer. For if even Japan, the most committed partner, takes steps to protect itself from the United States, what signal does that send to the rest of the world? In the next part, we'll analyze how Japan is rebuilding its alliance and the implications this will have for the future of the global economic order. Brace yourself, because the game is far from over, and the next step could change everything. Just a few years ago, it would have been unthinkable for Japan to view China as a more stable alternative to the United States. Yet, this is precisely the view that has been gaining traction among Japanese business and political leaders since 2025. And as alarming as it may seem, the numbers are beginning to justify this realignment. Toyota, an icon of the global auto industry with a presence in the United States for decades, has just finalized a $2 billion contract to build an electric vehicle factory in Shanghai. This decision alone speaks louder than any political statement. The company that sells the most cars in the United States is investing heavily in China amid tensions between Washington and Beijing. Why? Because Japan is tired of waiting for stability from those who simply exert pressure. Stop and think. If even Toyota, with its long history in the United States, is beginning to change its strategic course, how many other companies are quietly doing the same? This is not an isolated case. Mazda is also moving its production to Thailand, and other Japanese automakers are considering Vietnam and Indonesia as new production sites. These steps may seem modest, but overall they represent a radical change. Auto production, which once supported thousands of jobs in the United States, is now being relocated to countries that are less politically unstable, less expensive, and, above all, less exposed to hidden danger. Japan doesn't shout, it acts. And this is even more dangerous for the United States because when a wound is inflicted silently, the bleeding is harder to detect. Quick recap so far. Japan was perceived as a threat despite its massive investments in the American economy. In response, he began withdrawing his investment and looking for new allies. You are now doing business with countries that were previously considered on the other side of the game. And at the center of this transition is China. While the United States imposes tariffs and demands, China offers something simple: predictability. There's no friendship, but there is clarity. And for big business, that's enough. A little discussed fact: by 2024, Japanese exports to China will surpass those to the United States for the first time in nearly 15 years. This is not a coincidence, but a trend. Japanese companies are aligning their logistics, alliances, and strategies for a future where dependence on the United States represents a risk, not an advantage. The irony? The tariffs themselves could accelerate the United States' loss of influence in the Pacific. To protect its industries, Washington encourages its strategic partners to turn to other partners, and once trust is broken, rebuilding it can take generations. And if you think this is still far from reality, you're wrong. The model of your car, its price, your neighbor's job, your child's education cost, everything is linked to this invisible geopolitical network. The question that arises spontaneously is simple but profound. Can the United States still offer Japan and the world the trust a partner needs to build the future? Today, Tokyo takes it for granted that this is not the case, and this realignment is just the beginning. In the next episode, we'll examine how this loss of trust has affected America's image in the world. What happens when America's closest allies start asking, "What if we're next?" For decades, the relationship between Japan and the United States was held up as a model of a modern alliance, a pact built not only on formal agreements, but also on trust, respect, and mutual dependence. Japan trusted, invested, built, took risk, and hoped for predictability and loyalty in return. But in 2025, that expectation was shattered, not by armed conflict, but by something even more destructive: economic distrust. At this point in the story, an uncomfortable truth emerges. Japan isn't just reacting to tariffs, it's rethinking everything, and that's where it all starts to fall into place. Nissan's production cuts, Toyota's shift of investment to China, Japan's stubborn refusal to sign a new trade agreement without tariff adjustment. All these signals, which once seemed isolated, now point to a clear strategy. Japan is shaping its own future and freeing itself from its dependence on the United States. And the United States? Do you understand? Maybe it's not so urgent. In a context where trust trumps agreement, Tokyo perceived the mere imposition of tariffs on such a loyal partner as a betrayal. And Tokyo wasn't alone in noticing. South Korea, the Philippines, India, Vietnam, all were watching, silently but attentively. Because if even Japan, the most reliable ally, could be excluded, who would really be safe? And here's the key. This crisis goes beyond a trade conflict. It reveals a deep division within American leadership. When our own partners begin to look for alternatives, not for ideological reasons, but for survival, it reveals a fundamental flaw. Is the United States still the dominant power? Yes, but dominance without trust is like a castle without foundation. It breeds fear, but it doesn't inspire loyalty, and the consequences are already clearly visible. The American auto industry, supported for decades by Japanese investment, is showing signs of decline. Entire communities that depend on these factories are facing uncertainty. At the same time, Asia is solidifying its position as the new epicenter of automotive manufacturing and innovation, thanks to agreements between Japan, China, and Southeast Asian countries. The irony is bitter. By attempting to protect American jobs, tariffs have accelerated their loss. In an attempt to contain China, the United States has pushed Japan, albeit partially, into Beijing's arms. None of this was said out loud, but it's there, visible to all. At this point, the question no longer seems like who is right, but rather who adapts the fastest, who understands that today's alliances are not based on fear or coercion, but on mutual benefit and true trust. Japan understands this well. It is charting a new course, prioritizing its own interests, carefully selecting its partners, and determined to no longer be a mere supporting actor in other countries' geopolitical game. What's happening in the United States? There is still time to rebuild bridges, but doing so requires something increasingly rare in modern foreign policy: humility, the ability to admit that even giants make mistakes, and that sometimes, to continue leading, one must know how to turn back the clock. In this video, we saw how a seemingly indestructible alliance began to crumble. We saw the direct impact this had on industry, geopolitics, and people's lives. And, most importantly, we saw that decisions made at the top always have real-world repercussions, the consequences of which are not discussed, but endured. If you've made it this far, it's because you care about others, because you understand that relationships between countries shape the world in which you live, work, and raise your children. That's why I invite you to join our community. Subscribe to the channel. This simple gesture helps us continue to produce serious, in-depth, and not superficial content. I like this video, IF. It has opened up new perspectives for you. And the comment below, do you think this relationship can still be saved? What should the United States do now? Your opinion matters to us. It makes this video a global topic of discussion. Thank you for staying with us until the end. And get ready. The next article will take you even deeper into the transformations of the 21st century. Because when the world changes, and it changes quickly, the least we can do is understand where it's going. See you there.